first of all, Rebecca, you say that big tech companies can take a stand, and not necessarily in the way we might think. What can big companies do in this debate?
Absolutely. Well, they have to take a stand. There is no neutral position. They have an either-or choice. They can either protect pregnant people who are seeking medical care, or they can help anti-abortion prosecutions. And there's a couple different ways they can do this. One is they have a choice about what kind of information they will aid in disseminating to people who are pregnant and seeking access to medical care. So how do you access medication abortion? How do you access abortion clinics across state lines that remain open and functioning? Tech companies could choose to provide that information, provide free security services to websites disseminating that information so they're protected from vigilante hackers, or they could choose to use their content moderation policies to shut that information down and censor it.
On the
there are
other
a bunch
side,
of other things they could do as well.
Exactly. Well, let's talk about it all, because, something very valuable that big tech companies have is the data. And if law enforcement asks for this data, aren't they obligated to hand it over by law?
Great question. So it depends on what law enforcement uses when they ask. If law enforcement comes and says, pretty please, no, of course they're not required to hand it over. If law enforcement comes with a valid warrant, well then sure, a company has to comply. But actually, companies are receiving requests for data from law enforcement all the time. They have representatives that engage in negotiations around those requests, and they can choose to be more stringent, less helpful, shall I say, less providing efficient data distribution to law enforcement. They can challenge the scope of even a lawful warrant. There's something called a motion to quash. I really love the word quash. But Facebook or Meta has done this in the past with warrants, taken them to court to say this is overbroad, it's a fishing expedition, it's not sufficiently particular. And the tech companies know generally which laws are claimed to be violated when they receive a warrant. So one of the things they could do, even in that extreme where police are coming with, where anti-abortion prosecutors are coming with valid legal process, the company can also push back and assert rights to challenge that process in court. They could additionally notify the people whose information is being sought, so long as that's not prohibited by the warrant. And they could do things before they get to the warrant stage that would protect all this data that we're generating all the time from being used in anti-abortion prosecutions. So having end-to-end encryption for all your communications by default, giving warnings to users to say, if you choose this communication channel, your data is going to be subject to law enforcement surveillance. Storing data locally on users' devices instead of in the cloud, purging data, giving users the right to delete data remotely, foregoing using complex analytic systems to predict people's early pregnancies and abortions. All of these things they could be doing. They could say, we're not going to store location tracking data for people that are traveling near abortion clinics. So there is no neutral position. If they collect this data, they store it, they make it easy for law enforcement to access, that's a choice. They're aiding anti-abortion prosecutions.
Interesting. Well, we have heard from some prominent women in technology so far today. This from Melinda Gates. Today, a government in which women have never had an equal voice reached deep into the most private corners of a woman's life to tell her the choice over what she does with her body is no longer her own. This is America taking a big step backward. And this from Sheryl Sandberg. The Supreme Court's ruling jeopardizes the health and lives of millions of girls and women across the country. It threatens to undo the progress women have made in the workplace and strip women of economic power. She also points out that this will impact women the most with the fewest resources. Now, it's one thing for Sheryl Sandberg, who's the COO of Meta, and yes, she's leaving in September, to say this. It's another for Meta, the company, to take a stand. What more specifically could a company like Meta which has all of this information about what users are talking about to each other in private messages. What more could a company like Meta specifically do in this instance to take a stand? And what are they actually likely to do, given that these companies, the data, is their business model?
Well, they absolutely could take a stand to say that data that would subject people to criminal prosecution for abortions is going to be treated differently. They have enough data on all of us to serve their business model. They don't need data about people's private health choices in order to make money. So they could cordon off data that is going to make people vulnerable to criminal prosecutions and say, we're going to protect that. We're going to treat it differently. We're going to purge it. We're going to fight when law enforcement comes to access it. They could provide those privacy protections and use their power to reclaim some of the privacy from government intrusion that Roe once guaranteed and the court just eviscerated.
Do you see a wave of warrants, a wave of lawsuits and demands for this kind of information from law enforcement to tech companies to startups?
Absolutely. The data that we are generating in our everyday lives is already being used in criminal prosecutions. Fitbit data has been used in murder prosecutions. People's unencrypted text messages, web search histories, chat messages have already been used to charge one woman who miscarried with feticide and another with murder. So the location data, the web search histories, your emails, your communications, your associations, all of those are data that law enforcement can and does use and will pursue. This conversation has focused a lot on period tracking apps, which is a hugely important issue. How are those apps that serve reproductive choice needs going to protect people, protect their users? But in fact, it's all this other kind of data that will also leave people vulnerable. Heartbeat, sleep cycle data. Any of this information can be used as evidence in court to convict people of crimes.